In February 2022, Putin invades Ukraine. He does this in response to the persecution of Russians living in southern Ukraine and the threats of NATO expansion to his border. Putin has tried to negotiate these points, but the West, led by the United States, has used negotiations to buy time for the Ukrainian army to build up. Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons if the West threatens Russia or its people. Will Putin use nuclear weapons? In this documentary, we will examine Putin's psychosis, his anger, and previous close calls with nuclear apocalypse. These are warnings that need to be heeded.
Hey, we got a large haze. That's too big to be planes, right?
Is that what you want to do? Night to night 5? Boom! Wrong move.
Lieutenant, radar is picking up a large return, moving in from the northeast.
Hang on. Relax. This flight of B-17's coming in from the mainland.
Don't worry about a heck of a lot of B-17s.
Today, the members of the Science and Security Board moved the hands of the doomsday clock forward, largely, though not exclusively, because of the mounting dangers in the war in Ukraine. We moved the clock forward the closest it has ever been to midnight. It is now 90 seconds to midnight.
In the summer of 1999, the approval rating of former President Yeltsin was 2%. There appeared to be no chance whatever that Putin, who was designated by Yeltsin as his successor, could possibly become the next Russian president. The apartment bombings changed everything. It was said after those buildings went up that now we're living in a completely different country. Putin came forward as the savior of the country. He was put in charge of a war in Chechnya. The bombings were blamed on Chechens without any evidence whatsoever. And as a result of the successful prosecution of that war, against all odds, he was elected the next Russian president. The apartment bombings appear to be the keystone of a plot to confuse Russian public opinion, to create terror, to distract the Russian public, to redirect their anger away from the corruption that had flourished under Yeltsin and toward the Chechens, who had for a number of years a semi-independent government in Chechnya. And in that way create the conditions for the Russian people to vote in what they absolutely consciously did not want, which was a successor to Yeltsin who would protect Yeltsin. There was an enormous amount of material in the Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta, which pointed to the possibility and in fact the likelihood that the authorities themselves blew up those buildings. At the same time, a fifth bomb was discovered in the basement of an apartment building in Ryazan, which is a city southeast of Moscow. And I went to Ryazan after the bomb was discovered and defused to talk to local residents. And it was clear from those conversations that what took place was a genuine attempt to blow up a fifth building. The authorities said that this was only a training exercise, but it was nothing of the kind. And what was most important was that 3 persons were arrested for putting a bomb in a building in Ryazan. They turned out to be not Chechens, not terrorists in the usual sense, but rather agents of the Federal Security service.
Many of Putin's opponents inside Russia fled the country.
Forced into exile in England after.
Opponents saying, quote, "I'm scared that Putin will kill me."
Others died mysterious deaths.
Putin aide discovered dead in a D.C. hotel.
One who nearly died twice from poisoning was Vladimir Karamurza.
Bad things often happen to
There's been a very high mortality rate in the last several years among the people who have crossed the path of Vladimir Putin's Kremlin. Independent journalists, anti-corruption campaigners, opposition activists, opposition leaders. Many people have died. Some in strange and unexplained deaths, others in just straight-out assassinations.
Now, as vice president, Biden traveled to Moscow to meet with Putin. The two men smiled for the cameras, but later things were different. Putin argumentative, Biden wary.
It's a seminal meeting in part because of the mythology that is created out of it. It's kind of like a marker being put down, I think, between two men who ultimately we thought would find themselves in this great clash that we're in today.
Biden would write about the moment in his autobiography.
It was long and contentious. Putin was ice-cold calm throughout, but argumentative from the start to finish.
Well, I was there with then Vice President Biden. The message that he's sending is, let's not, we're not here to kid each other. We need to speak clearly. We need to speak directly.
I'm looking into your eyes, I told him, smiling. I don't think you have a soul. He looked at me for a second and smiled back. We understand each other, he said. And we did.
When Biden said that to me, I hadn't heard it before, and my immediate reaction was, this sounds like a movie line. Is that what really happened? And he said, absolutely, positively, that's who this guy is.
The crisis in Ukraine escalated today with a rocket attack that killed dozens. It happened in the port city of Mariupol, which is now a crucial target for the Russian-backed rebels who rejected a peace deal with the government of Ukraine yesterday. Here's Charlie D'Agata.
Chaos struck in a matter of minutes, shattering the calm of a wintry Saturday morning in Mariupol. Out of nowhere, rockets slammed into residential neighborhoods, markets, even schools. Bodies lay strewn on the streets. Ukrainian officials said more than 36 people were killed, 100 or more wounded. People were laying on the floor and they weren't moving, said this resident. Many more carried away, and the wounded needed help to walk. The assault came after Russian-backed rebels announced the start of a new offensive to take over more territory. Mariupol is a strategic target, the biggest city between mainland Russia and the Crimean Peninsula it took over last year. This week, in the rebel-held city of Donetsk, mortars struck a crowded bus stop, killing at least 13 people. Russian President Vladimir Putin put the blame for that attack on Ukraine. The new Russian-backed offensive diminishes hope that falling oil prices and tougher sanctions might have persuaded Putin to stabilize the situation. A September ceasefire never really took hold. International observers now estimate that more than 5,000 people have been killed in the conflict, and the bloodshed has returned to levels not seen since the peak of fighting last summer. Charlie D'Agata, CBS News, London.
It appears is now underway.
And soon, more fuel for Putin's grievance with the U.S.
U.S.-led attack on Iraq appears.
The Iraq War.
America at war. Tonight, shock and awe.
Regime change at the hands of the Bush administration.
The Stars and Stripes have come to town. Saddam Hussein's reign of terror is over.
The Iraq War was absolutely a turning point in a very significant moment of rupture in the relationship between Putin and President Bush.
For Putin, echoes of the final days of the Soviet Union.
The tyrant has fallen, and Iraq is free. And everywhere that freedom stirs, let tyrants fear.
An adventure like the Iraq
war shows him that, look, they'll just come in and they'll just take out a government and think nothing of it. And that's not the way he wanted the world to work.
And it is both our responsibility and our privilege to fight freedom's fight.
Bush called it the Freedom Agenda, a plan to export American democracy around the world. Putin saw it as a direct threat to his own plan to restore Russian greatness.
Vladimir Putin concluded that the United States, when possible, would use its power and leverage to depose leaders that it did not agree with. And from Vladimir Putin's perspective, that was an existential threat.
The Bush doctrine is spreading freedom around the world.
Under Bush, that threat was extending to Putin's own backyard.
Responsibility around the world to extend freedom.
Popular uprisings in former Soviet republics.
Bush really believes that democracy can be planted almost anywhere.
Americans respect your courageous choice for liberty. The American people will stand with you.
Putin concluded that these were efforts by the United States and our intelligence services to, in fact, install in these neighboring countries regimes that would be anti-Russian.
Putin had seen enough. He would fight back.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is speaking at an international conference in Germany.
He'd do it in Munich, Germany, issuing a warning to America and the world.
And so he comes to the security conference in Munich and says, basically, I don't have to mince words, do I? I can say what's on my mind. And then he just lashes out and he lists all these resentments.
Прежде всего, конечно, Соединенных Штатов перешагнула свои национальные границы и, по сути, во всех сферах, и в экономике, и в политике, и в гуманитарной сфере навязывается другим государствам. Ну, кому это понравится? Кому это понравится? Почему же сейчас?
My head snapped. It was so searing and blunt, and I felt this was the real guy.
И это, конечно, крайне опасно. И ведет к тому, что никто уже не чувствует себя в безопасности. Я хочу это подчеркнуть. Никто не чувствует себя в безопасности.
Putin echoed Cold War rhetoric by accusing the U.S. of making the world unsafe.
Premier Vladimir Putin left no doubt who he sees as responsible for the current global crisis.
Putin, clearly in this speech, was drawing a line and saying, we're not going to try anymore. We're just giving up on you, and we're going to make our own world in which we are the master.
It's one of Putin's harshest attacks on America in his 7-year term.
After that speech, we saw the first long-range nuclear bombers by Russia. We saw the devastating cyber attack in Estonia in 2007. We were starting to see steps taken that represented a Russia assertiveness that we had not seen. We did not necessarily understand that 2007 is the date where he wanted to stop that democratic encroachment.
The leaders of NATO begin a 2-day summit today.
It's been 6 years since the establishment of the NATO-Russia Council.
But Bush ignored Putin's warning.
Taken by this summit will affect the future of the alliance.
Ratcheting up the conflict, encouraging Georgia and Ukraine, two former Soviet republics, to join NATO.
We must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO.
The Russians were obviously very, very concerned that the Bush administration was moving towards allowing both Georgia and Ukraine to get into NATO, which was for them a huge red line.
Putin rushed to Bucharest to confront Bush.
There's this amazing moment. Putin shows up early and crashes the dinner with the NATO members. He has basically shown up as the skunk in the garden and challenging them for what they've done.
In a meeting later, Putin was adamant to Bush. Georgia, and especially Ukraine, were in his sphere of influence.
He leaned over and said, Ukraine is not a real country. He had no respect for the sovereignty of the Ukrainian people. We should have seen it earlier. Maybe we didn't want to see it, but it was clear if we had wanted to see it, the direction that President Putin was going.
Putin made it clear he wouldn't accept Bush's plan for Georgia and Ukraine.
Peace agreement in 2014, and it was called the Minsk Accords. And so what that was supposed to do was avoid a war between Russia and Ukraine. And what was the war over? So the people, the Russia-speaking separatists in the Donbass, didn't want to go along with the coup of Ukraine. So a bunch of right-wingers overthrew the government with the help of the United States and the CIA in 2014, overthrew the government. And the people in the Donbass didn't want to go along with it. The Russian-speaking people in the eastern part of Ukraine didn't want to go along with this coup. And so there was fighting. And so we had the Minsk agreement, and that was supposed to give autonomy to the people in the Donbass. And then they were supposed to be able to have their own local elections. And the Ukraine government was going to stop bombing them. Well, they never abided by it. The Ukraine government never stopped bombing. Here's Max Blumenthal says, Angela Merkel reveals the Minsk agreement was a stalling tactic that allowed the West to militarize Ukraine as an anti-Russian proxy and fortify it for an inevitable war. I'm struggling to find any coverage or analysis of this remarkable confession in English language mainstream media. You will not. This will be it. This will be it here. Merkel on Minsk echoes ex-Ukrainian President Poroshenko. Our goal was to first stop the threat, or at least to delay the war, to secure 8 years to restore economic growth and create powerful armed forces, reminiscent of Israel exploiting Oslo to create facts on the ground. So there you go. They weren't. So now why would Russia ever negotiate with Ukraine or NATO in good faith? Because Ukraine wasn't. Nobody was in the West negotiating with good faith. And so they provoked this war. Who wanted this war? Russia didn't want this war. You know who did? The United States and NATO. They wanted this war. And so we got a war. The Ukraine people don't want this war. Zelensky doesn't want this war. He's doing it because he knows if he doesn't, he'll get killed by the right-wing Azov battalion, the Nazis in Ukraine, or he'll get disappeared by NATO.
We're engaging on a daily basis with the Ukrainian government to make sure that we get a positive outcome there.
Russians have repeatedly accused the United States government of interfering in Ukraine's politics. Mm-hmm. The U.S. government has to some degree made reciprocal claims about Russia. Does not the fact that U.S. diplomats purportedly are discussing who should and should not be in a Ukrainian government hint at some possibility of U.S. interference here?
Absolutely not.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now, so we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea. I think Yachts is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. I just think Cleach going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay.
When I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah, I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And I think
it shouldn't be a surprise that there are discussions about events on the ground.
This was more than discussions, though. This was two top U.S. officials that are on the ground discussing a plan that they have to broker a future government and bringing officials from the UN to kind of seal the deal. This is more than the U.S. trying to make suggestions. This is the U.S. midwifing the process.
Well, Elise, you're talking about a private diplomatic conversation. Those happen all the time. Of course, as part of private diplomatic conversations, there are discussions about what involvement the UN can have, what involvement or engagement should happen on the ground. That shouldn't be a surprise. Of course, these things are being discussed. It doesn't change the fact that it's up to the people on the ground. It is up to the people of Ukraine to determine what the path forward is. There is a difference between private discussions that happen in the interagency process, in the building, and what we convey publicly as a U.S. government. And we have a responsibility to convey what our position is. Of course, you're discussing a range of options on a range of issues.
But if you,
that's what you do as a diplomat.
If you're saying privately behind the scenes that you're cooking up a deal, and then you're saying publicly that this is up for Ukrainians to decide, those are two totally different things. I understand that diplomatic discussions are sensitive and you don't want everything to come out, but those are two totally different positions.
Elise, what do you think happens behind closed doors when people are discussing issues internally through the interagency?
This is not discussing issues. This is talking about a deal that the U.S. was cooking up.
The war in Ukraine would have ended in April this year as Russia and Ukraine agreed to a tentative peace plan. Then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson happened. Boris Johnson landed in Ukraine unannounced, catching even the Ukrainian regime by surprise. Startling details of the intent of Boris Johnson's sudden visit to Ukraine are now beginning to come out. It turns out the then British Prime Minister, at the behest of the West, scuttled any chances of Ukraine and Russia settling for peace. A foreign affairs analysis by Fiona Hill and Angela Stent has given rise to quite a scandal in the world of geopolitics. Titled "The World Putin Wants," the Foreign Affairs article dropped a bombshell as it said this, and I quote, "According to multiple former senior US officials we spoke with, in April 2022, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators appeared to have tentatively agreed on the outlines of a negotiated interim settlement. According to the tentative peace plan, Russia would withdraw to its position on February 23rd when it controlled part of the Donbas region and all of Crimea, and in exchange, Ukraine would promise not to seek NATO membership and instead receive security guarantees from a number of countries. Now, why did this plan turn dead on arrival? According to Ukrainian publication Ukrainska Pravda, following the arrival of British Prime Minister Boris Johnson in Kyiv in April, a possible meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin was put off. According to the publication, which has sources close to Zelensky, Boris Johnson carried to Ukraine two messages from the West. First, Putin is a war criminal and he should be pressured, not negotiated with. Second, and most importantly, even if Ukraine is ready to sign some agreements on guarantees with Putin, they, as in the West, are not. So, why does the West not want peace in Ukraine? Boris Johnson was definitely not acting out of his own accord. In successfully scuttling any scope of peace between Russia and Ukraine, Boris Johnson ended up serving the collective interests of the West. The West, for some strange reason, does not want the fighting in Ukraine to end anytime soon. Boris Johnson is believed to have told Zelensky and his government in Ukraine that the West believes Putin was not really as powerful as they had previously imagined and that there was a chance to quote-unquote press him. Countries in the West, like the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, and basically all of NATO have been helping Ukraine with weapons worth billions of dollars. The conflict in Ukraine coming to an end would mean Western defense manufacturers would not be able to mint the kind of money they are currently making. Furthermore, peace between Russia and Ukraine would severely unsettle the West's campaign of isolationism against Moscow and Vladimir Putin. Eventually, the world's trade with Russia would return to normal and Moscow would demand for sanctions to be lifted if Ukraine's security is to be guaranteed.
Говорит только о том, что мы все правильно сделали с точки зрения начала специальной военной операции. Почему? Потому что, оказывается, все эти Минские соглашения никто не собирался исполнять. И можно ли с кем-то договариваться? И где гарантии? Вот это, конечно, вопрос. Но все равно в конечном итоге договариваться придется. Я уже много раз говорил, что мы к этим договоренностям готовы.
What do you think about the mainstream news coverage of this series of events? And why has the war dragged out like this?
I think two reasons. First of all, from the very beginning, President Putin was very reluctant to confront the West militarily. He still is. And I think he went into Ukraine with unrealistic expectations, the wrong assumptions. He thought, well, if I go in, I show I'm serious, but I don't do too much, then the West will negotiate. Well, it took several months for him to figure out no one is not going to negotiate. If anything, they viewed what he did as evidence for weakness. So he had to essentially call a timeout, reorganize, reorient, and he listened to the senior leadership that said, we don't have enough troops to do what we need to do. So now you have almost 750,000 troops involved. And there are talks behind the scenes about continuing the mobilization and adding another 300,000 or 400,000 men, because increasingly Putin is concluding he's not going to find anyone to talk to, and he will ultimately have to march to the Polish border.
President Biden, meanwhile, is back at the White House this morning, returning overnight from a trip to Europe that ended with a fiery speech in Warsaw, including an off-the-cuff remark about Vladimir Putin that shocked the diplomatic world. NBC
Leader, during a speech Saturday night, President Biden addressed the West's growing confrontation with Russia, then deviated from his prepared remarks on Putin to say this.
A dictator bent on rebuilding an empire will never erase a people's love for liberty. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
That last ad-libbed line drew a swift and forceful response from the Russians, who said that's not for Biden to decide, that the president of Russia is elected by Russians. A White House official later saying this wasn't about regime change, but about Putin not exercising power in the region. The ad-lib line, something of a distraction from a speech that the White House had hoped would help set the global stakes of this confrontation between democracies like those in NATO and Ukraine and autocratic states like Russia.
He saw it as a direct threat to his own plan to restore Russian greatness.
Vladimir Putin concluded that the United States, when possible, would use its power and leverage to depose leaders that it did not agree with.
In October of 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba discovered that the Russians had installed intermediate-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads to most of the United States. This represented an unacceptable threat to American security. The Kennedy administration proposed 4 different solutions to the crisis: diplomacy, an airstrike taking out the missiles, an invasion overthrowing the Castro regime, or a naval blockade. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, had secretly prepared responses for the U.S. invasion of Cuba. Short-range tactical nuclear weapons launched at invading forces would have initiated World War III. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense at the time, questioned Fidel Castro 30 years later if he would have used these weapons.
It wasn't until January 1992, in a meeting chaired by Castro in Havana, Cuba, that I learned 162 nuclear warheads, including 90 tactical warheads, were on the island at the time of this critical moment of the crisis. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and Castro got very angry with me because I said, Mr. President, let's stop this meeting. This is totally new to me. I'm not sure I got the translation right. Mr. President, I have 3 questions to you. Number 1, did you know the nuclear warheads were there? Number two, if you did, would you have recommended to Khrushchev, in the face of a U.S. attack, that he use them? Number three, if he had used them, what would have happened to Cuba? He said, number one, I knew they were there. Number two, I would not have recommended to Khrushchev. I did recommend to Khrushchev that they be used. Number three, what would have happened to Cuba? It would have been totally destroyed. That's how close we were.
And he was willing to accept that?
Yes. Oh, and he went on to say, Mr. McNamara, if you and President Kennedy had been in a similar situation, that's what you would have done. I said, Mr. President, I hope to God we would not have done it. Pull the temple down on our heads, my God.
Kennedy orders a ring of ships to surround Cuba and the Caribbean and stop the flow of any more Soviet weaponry.
The Soviet Union countered the naval blockade by deploying 4 submarines, each carrying nuclear-tipped torpedoes. One of the submarines, B-59, was discovered by Navy destroyers. They attempted to force the submarine to the surface by dropping practice depth charges around it.
The Americans have been tracking B-59 for 2 hours.
We weren't trying to kill them. We could have very easily killed that submarine. We wanted to harass it. We knew they were probably having difficulty breathing. It was hot as hell in there. It was miserable. They were cramped together, and they had been under great strain for a long time. So what we were trying to do is basically apply passive torture.
The typical response would be, if he wanted to come to the surface, he would fire a flare, and we would say, you're clear to surface. But that didn't happen.
The men aboard B-59 are frightened and confused. With no new orders in over a week, B-59 has no idea the depth charges are meant as a warning.
We dropped the 5 practice depth charges to invite the submarine to come to the surface.
There is a specific signal that we have, and that is 3 explosions, grenade explosions, which means you have to surface. I don't know what the Americans were doing, but it wasn't 3.
The American signal to surface is different from the Russians.
Any word from Moscow?
Communications have completely broken down. The Coney's slow torture of B-59 continues for 5 hours.
We can't do anything until we hear from Moscow.
Leonenko, get to the bridge.
Savitsky never lost it. He just made a decision.
Sir! It's time to load the special weapon. Sir, give me your key, Maslenikov.
Withering temperatures exceeding 120 degrees, no contact with home. A ship virtually out of power.
It's time to load the special weapon!
And now seemingly under attack.
Come on! We will sink all the fleet, but we will not humiliate Russia.
Savitsky was an impulsive man, but in his mind, at that moment, he made a correct decision.
Give me your key, Maslenikov.
What are you thinking?
Your key, Maslenikov.
He had no rights because Vasily was in charge. He was the commander of the fleet of all the ships. But Savitsky was the commander of this ship.
The commander is the second in command after God. These are the rules the submarines live by.
We don't know that this is an attack. For all we know, they are trying to surface us.
The future of the world now rests on Vasily Arkhipov's shoulders.
We have orders to defend ourselves.
You may be captain of this ship, but I am commander of this fleet, and you need my permission.
Vasily Arkhipov was our commander of the fleet. He was a submariner and a close friend of mine. He was a family friend. He stood out for being cool-headed. He was in control. He was a real submariner.
Two of us have agreed. Do I have your permission?
No. You need all three of us.
He knew that it was madness to fire a nuclear torpedo.
Place the special weapon in the initial position and restore protection.
And especially that he lived through that and saw it. He didn't hesitate to say no.
God only blessed the man because what would have happened after that? We would have been in a nuclear war with Soviet Russia, and there would perhaps not be a world.
It's time to make contact with the Americans.
We were already prepared to use nuclear weapons. We had all of our strategic aircraft ready to fly to Russia, armed with nuclear weapons. So there was no doubt in my mind that we would have had a nuclear exchange with the Russians if their nuclear ballistic missiles worked.
Their cover blown, the ordeal for the men of B-59 is finally over. Each takes time to leave the sub and breathe fresh air.
We were steaming very close to the submarine. He was on the port side, the left side of the ship, in the dark with the night lights on. It was about, I would say it was about midnight when I finally got up there to have a look at him. They weren't 7 feet tall, and they didn't have fangs coming out of their mouth.
Now, I personally had never seen a Russian naval officer. As far as I was concerned, he was from central casting. Dour, squatty-faced, and he looked pretty mean, actually.
The U.S. Navy makes no attempt to board B-59 as it lies outside Kennedy's quarantine line.
Fire control. Sir, report. All systems in automatic control, sir. Weapons ready for firing when on.
You're not chasing whales now, Finlander. You're pushing him too far.
Right, Captain. We must stop this madness.
Well, you still think I'm frightening, eh, Commodore?
Sub-Captain and his crew will act now like animals, fighting for survival.
This is my job.
Now it's your job, Captain. Take off this action, or you force him to fight.
So you think he's going to fire at us, do you?
I would in his place, so would you.
CIC. Sir? What's the target aspect?
Target showing minimum surface area, sir. Bow on.
Thank you. Fire control.
Sir.
Arm number 1, Azra.
Aye, aye, sir. Number 1, Azra. Armed and ready, sir.
Captain, you are a fool.
Finlander, leave it alone.
Take it easy, Ralston. All systems in automatic control, sir. Weapons armed and ready.
Take it easy.
Fire control, A-OK, sir. All systems armed and ready.
This is insane.
Now, don't worry, Commodore. The Bedford will never fire first. But if he fires one, I'll fire one.
Fire one.
Did you disarm it?
I don't know.
Back to your stations. All engines stop. Engines stop. Back to your stations. All hands. All hands.
Remain at general quarters. Remain at general quarters.
Sonar? Sir. We tried to disarm the warhead in time, but we don't know.
Captain?
Keep listening.
Yes, sir. I'm checking the torpedo now, sir. It's touched down pretty close.
Holding contact, Captain. It's funny, but I'm picking up... Jeez!
Sonar.
Sir.
Keep ranging.
Yes, sir.
Captain? Captain, there's... Oh, my God.
What is it?
Torpedoes! Range 2,000 yards. Closing.
Right full rudder. All ahead flank. Allison, actuate countermeasures. Right full rudder, sir.
All engines ahead flank, sir.
Torpedoes approaching, bearing 130. 4 of them at intervals.
He must have fired as soon as he heard the ASROC break the surface.
What's the range?
1,500, coming straight on. Range 1,300, speed 40, closing.
You have a torpedo evasion plan, haven't you? Well, have you or haven't you? Captain! Come on! You knew there was this chance. Do something! Finlander! Answer me, damn you!
In early 1983,
Stanislav Petrov was a lieutenant colonel for the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces, specializing in the development of a satellite nuclear warning system, engineered to stop a U.S. first strike. After graduating, he was sent to a new early warning facility, Serpukhov 15, near Moscow.
When we arrived, there were only several houses. Nobody knew anything. There was nothing. We had to start everything from scratch. We worked at our main institution, which had developed the warning system, Kometa. This is quite a complicated space system. The satellite would orbit. It would cover the missile threat region of the United States of America.
The new Russian warning system was composed of 9 satellites that had a view of the Earth's surface over America. Any launch from there should have been detected quickly by observing the rocket plumes over the horizon, or so went the Russian theory.
One entire wall was taken up by a reconnaissance display that depicted the map of the globe and the territory of the US. Their rocket ranges were marked there. There were exactly 1,000 rockets on 6 bases.
On the evening of the 29th of September, 1983, Colonel Petrov took over the command of Serpukhov 15 as the officer on duty.
It was normal routine work. Time was passing by. At around 10 p.m., we were finished with our tea and food. Time was approaching when the spacecraft came into orbit. All was going well. We were prepared just in case. And this just in case happened.
Colonel Petrov had received a signal confirming an American nuclear attack.
There was a big overhead display with huge letters, like a wall banner at my eye level. Start. The siren howled. The reports started coming in about the launching of a ballistic rocket from the United States of America. The first reaction was shock. Something that we should have been ready for had actually happened. There was a status panel in front of me, and on the left, one rocket range in the US was lit up. Next to it, there was a number 1 launching rocket. The probability indicated was the highest possible.
The Soviet early warning computer had to go through 30 levels of security checks before it confirmed an actual missile launch. The team scrambled to check the authenticity of the signal. They had only 28 minutes until the impact.
I started giving commands, everyone in place, monitor all functions, do this and that, according to instructions. Everything pointed to a yes except for one thing. The launch was not confirmed visually. 30 levels of defense. To get through them was serious.
Because of the lack of visual confirmation, Petrov decided to wait before he informed the high military command of what was happening.
As I was the first source of this information, the danger was that as soon as I made a decision that this rocket is real, the rest of the chain of command could have been hypnotized by my conclusions. It is like the rule of roosters in a chicken coop. The first rooster starts to crow, and the rest follow it throughout the whole village.
Petrov was unable to find any faults in the system. The situation grew worse.
Another alarm came on. The system showed another rocket, then a third, fourth, fifth, all within 5 minutes. So there is a rocket attack sign on the overhead displays now.
Petrov needed to make a decision, one of history's most important.
When there is a massive launch, it is impossible to miss. Half of the population gets destroyed right away.
12 minutes had already passed. If Petrov had warned the high command at this stage, they would have had only minutes left to brief General Secretary Yuri Andropov to decide whether to launch a counterstrike.
I had to make a decision. I decided this was a false alarm. I decided, in the end, that it would be less damaging to qualify the rockets we detected as false alarms. After 10 or 11 minutes passed, the relief came. The over-the-horizon radiolocation radar stations did not find anything, and the decision I had made was confirmed. The start was false. The detection was false.
The false detection had been created by a rare alignment of sunlight that reflected via the Earth into the satellite's lenses. The incident embarrassed the military command of the Soviet Army. Petrov was made into a scapegoat. He was eventually forced into early retirement. In January 2006, Petrov was honored at a ceremony at the United Nations headquarters. In the Western press, he became known as the man who saved the world.
Пошел и ядерный шантаж. Речь идет не только о поощряемых Западом обстрелах Запорожской атомной электростанции, что грозит атомной катастрофой, но и о высказываниях некоторых высокопоставленных представителей ведущих государств НАТО о возможности и допустимости применения против России оружия массового поражения, ядерного оружия. Тем, кто позволяет себе такие заявления в отношении России, хочу напомнить, что наша страна также располагает различными средствами поражения, а по отдельным компонентам и более современными, чем у стран НАТО. И при угрозе территориальной целостности нашей страны для защиты России и нашего народа мы, безусловно, используем все имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении средства. Это не блеф.
Target distance 7 miles. Correct track indicator -7.
Roger, 7 miles. Set GPI acceleration factor.
GPI acceleration factor set.
Target distance 6 miles.
Roger, 6 miles. Pulse ident transponder active.
Pulse ident transponder active.
Target distance 5 miles.
5 miles. Humming alignment factor, 0 mode.
Humming alignment factor to 0 mode.
Target distance 4 miles.
Roger, 4 miles. Auto CDC into manual teleflex link.
Auto CDC into manual teleflex link.
Target distance 3 miles.
Roger, 3 miles. Target in sight. Where in hell is Major Kong?
Hey, what about Major Kong?
word first uttered this week by President Biden at a closed-door Democratic fundraiser in New York, where he said, quote, "I don't think there's any such thing as the ability to easily use a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up with Armageddon," the risk of which, he added, the world hasn't faced since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Russia has an estimated 1,000 to 2,000 short-range nuclear weapons at storage sites around the country, including one close to the Ukrainian border. They could be launched from an aircraft, from the sea, or from the ground by a nuclear artillery shell. Here's one being tested by the U.S. Army in the 1950s.
For what the Russians have been saying about this incident, the Russians have been insisting that that fighter jet, the Russian fighter jet, did not ever make contact with that drone. Well, now we can see that the video really does belie that explanation. We're seeing that the fighter jet actually comes up extremely close to the drone. You're watching it right there, starts releasing a lot of jet fuel, as U.S. officials had said it did. It hits that drone. That is when the camera footage goes out. And then when the camera footage reappears, you can see that the propeller of that drone is damaged. And that is exactly the sequence of events that U.S. officials had laid out.
From mutiny to missiles and the Russian nuclear warheads, the Kremlin says it's moving to Belarus. Would Mr. Lukashenko have a say in whether to launch them? I remind him, recently you said, God forbid I should have to take the decision to use nuclear weapons.
Joe Biden could say the same, and Prime Minister Sunak.
But these aren't your weapons, they're Russian ones. It's not your decision to take.
In Ukraine, a whole army is fighting with foreign weapons, with NATO weapons, because they've run out of their own. So why can't I fight with someone else's?
But these are nuclear. We're not talking pistols.
Yes, nuclear. They're weapons too. And make sure you mention we're talking about tactical nuclear weapons here.
The logic of a leader who, with an iron fist and the Kremlin's backing, has held power for nearly 30 years.
Worst case scenario, Russia is on the eastern flank of NATO's border. What does that mean?
The Ukrainians would continue to fall back to the west of their country. I think at that point, NATO probably puts boots on the ground and a no-fly zone up, because at this stage, we are not going to simply walk away from the Ukrainians.
Is that World War III?
We have to be careful here that we don't self-deter, that we don't take counsel of our fears and say, ooh, Putin's got nuclear weapons. That's really scary.
That's the lesson of this last year, is to not.
It is. If we hold our nerve, I think in the end, it'll be Russia who cracks.
Spars is now tracking more than 400 Russian ICBMs, heading for U.S. mainland, striking in about 20 minutes.
Colonel, is there anything indicating a possible intrusion in the network? Anything at all?
No, sir. Every indication is that we are under attack, Mr. President.
Sir, I recommend initiating night watch continuity of government protocol immediately.
Do it. Major, open the football.
If you don't launch before the Russian missiles hit, they can take out our silos, severely limiting our response.
We'd lose an entire leg of the nuclear triad.
There has to be a better option than just responding in kind to an all-out Russian attack. It'd almost certainly bring on a nuclear winter, killing everyone on the planet. We have to think about that.
Nuclear winter is a theory, Russell. The president has to execute what we've been gaming and planning for decades.
There's only one way to fulfill your constitutional obligation, Mr. President. It's major attack option 1.
Does anyone disagree with that assessment? Do we have the Pentagon War Room on the line?
Yes, Mr. President. General Nelson here, ready to authenticate the nuclear launch codes on your call.
Close to the double pipe. Yeah, well, we need it now. Well, I mean, here we go. Not a drill. Unlock launch keys?
I agree.
Alpha, Zulu, X-ray.
have a match. Authentication confirmed.
I agree.
Belt up. Insert launch keys.
Mid-course phase, warheads detaching. Tracking more than 2,000.
Oh my God.
No! Abort! Abort! Now! Send a new AM aboard. Do it! Oh my God!
Watch actions, hands on keys.
I agree.
Fire on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark.
Mr. Nixon, General Curtis LeMay became Governor Wallace's running mate today, and he immediately said that he would use a nuclear bomb to win in Vietnam. How do you feel about the use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam or elsewhere?
I do not believe that nuclear bombs or nuclear weapons should be used in Vietnam. I do not think they're necessary to be used in Vietnam, and we should not risk a nuclear war in Vietnam by any manner of the means. We learned pretty quickly that his secret plan was to threaten the North Vietnamese with nuclear weapons. That was his plan. And he was convinced that the way to make the threat credible was for the North Vietnamese to fear that he was crazy and might actually do this.
Nixon goes over the top with 287 electoral votes, and that seems to be the 1968 election.
After his election, there was a feeling in the anti-war movement of exhaustion. We felt devastated by the Nixon election, and there were a lot of questions like, what should we be doing? What needs to be done? And what do we do next? We didn't know at that time that they were already planning to blow up Vietnam.
Dr. Kissinger is a man who is known to all people who are interested in foreign policy as perhaps one of the major scholars in America and the world today in this area. And I trust under his direction, he will develop new ideas and new policies for the critical problems America has in the field of foreign policy around the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored by the confidence that the President-elect has expressed in me, and I shall serve the President-elect with all my energy and dedication.
Kissinger and I had been colleagues together at Harvard. I came into the government in '66, and I very quickly came to believe that we had no idea what we were doing in Vietnam, and that it was hopeless and that we should get out, which of course Kissinger knew. Kissinger and I taught a seminar at Harvard called the Defense Policy Seminar. There's actually a very famous New York Times picture of the last class of the seminar in 1968, because I alerted the New York Times to the fact that this was going to be Henry's last class. The photographer walks in, and Henry says, "This will be good for my megalomania." After the class was over, Kissinger asked to talk to me. He said that he wanted to ask me to come and work for him in the White House, and I immediately said yes. Kissinger had a sense of urgency because by Inauguration Day, Nixon wanted a paper on options for what should be done in Vietnam. We looked at a range of options all the way towards the one that I favored, which was announcing that we would withdraw all our forces. The paper went to Nixon, and his response was, "This is a good options paper, but the option that I'm interested in is not in the paper, and that's the option of escalating." I was surprised by the escalation request, mostly because I thought it was infeasible, that the country wouldn't stand for it. And I said to Kissinger, if you go in this direction, it will become Nixon's war. And Kissinger went off and talked to Nixon and came back and said he will be proud to have it called Nixon's war.
Nixon wanted to end the war quickly, and the way he hoped to do that was by threatening the North Vietnamese with a major escalation of the war. And he had this idea that somehow he could convince the North Vietnamese that he was capable of anything, to blow them to smithereens.
H.R. Haldeman, who became Nixon's chief of staff, revealed in his memoirs that during the '68 campaign, Nixon had discussed with him how he expected effectively to win the war in Vietnam. Nixon's secret plan was to threaten the North Vietnamese that he would go to a much higher level of escalation than President Johnson had ever managed, including the use of nuclear weapons. But how to make the North Vietnamese believe that he would do it? He said, we'll get the word to them that this guy is unpredictable, crazy, we can't control him, and he has his finger on the nuclear button. And Nixon said to Haldeman, Ho Chi Minh will be in Paris the next day to negotiate. And in his own mind, the word was used, madman. He said, I call it the madman theory, Bob. And by the way, privately, I believe, Nixon was that crazy.
It has now come to Richard Nixon as it came so often to his predecessor, Lyndon Johnson. The sight of hundreds of sign-carrying women marching in front of the White House, demanding an immediate end to the war in Vietnam. It was all very peaceful and quiet. So was Lyndon Johnson's first anti-war demonstration.
Nixon is acutely aware of the fact that Lyndon Johnson's presidency had been essentially destroyed by the anti-war movement. That's not lost on him at all. And he doesn't want to be in that spot.
We had brought 500,000 people to Washington, which at that time and for quite a long time to come was the largest demonstration that had ever been organized.
The White House acknowledged that the latest protests generally were peaceful, but stressed again that President Nixon does not intend to let policy be made in the streets.
It quickly set in that the war raged on. That however proud of ourselves we might have been, we obviously at that point hadn't stopped the war.
The demonstrations in October and November of 1969 did not have the appearance of changing anything because the war went on as before. And none of people who participated knew that the war had been within days or weeks of erupting enormously and becoming much bigger. The bottom line is, I believe we would have had the first nuclear attacks since Nagasaki in 1969 had it not been for the October 15th demonstrations and the demonstrations in November.
There's a story in his biography that Putin tells about himself. It happened in this building, where he shared a one-room apartment with his parents, and it involved a cornered rat.
He said that I learned very good. I learned forever. Don't try to push somebody into the corner. They will jump. Because when you don't have what to lose, you attack. I think it's absolutely true about himself. When he's in the corner, that's why he's dangerous. He can jump. He will not say, okay, let's talk. He will jump.
While defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
It ain't nothing but a heartbreaker. I got one friend, that's the Undertaker. Oh, war has shattered many a young man's dreams, made him disabled, bitter and mean. Life is much too short and precious to spend fighting wars each day. War can't give life, it can only take it away. Oh, war! Good God, y'all. What is it good for? Absolutely. Nothing. Say it again. War. Oh, Lord. What is it good for? Absolutely. Nothing. Listen to me. War.